hasn't been here earlier in the day, I keep telling everybody I'm the executive director here. I'm very happy to be here. I hope you've all had a chance to go in and see 6,000 plus declarations of independence. If you haven't, please do. That is an incredible art exhibit by Joe Young, who's doing some comic book workshops today underneath that awning over there. And anybody can join in and have success. We've proven it already today, so please join in. Now we're going to have a talk from Dr. Dexter Gabriel. He is a professor of history at the University of Connecticut. He earned his BA and his MA in history from Texas State University, San Marcos, and his Ph.D. in history from Stony Brook University-New York. His research interests include the histories of slavery, resistance, and freedom in the Black Atlantic, as well as interdisciplinary approaches to slavery within popular culture and media. He teaches courses on the UCONN campus ranging from African American history to 1865, comparative slavery in the Americas, and slavery in film, just to name a few. His most recent published book, Jubilee's Experiment, The British West Indies and American Abolitionism, explores British emancipation in the Anglo-Caribbean and its impact on abolitionist strategies in the 19th century United States. Dr. Gabriel.
Thank you, everyone. Glad to be here. Yeah, the mic is not that loud, but I'm fine. I'm gonna try not to talk long because it's hot. So I'll see what I get through that, and I got some ribs on the smoke I got to get back to. So I'm trying to post things. So here we are on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And when I was asked to speak on this, I didn't know exactly what I was going to talk about, and then I happened to be looking at a photograph of this parade called the Silent March in 1917. I kind of had an idea of where to start this. So, set the story, about July 2nd, 1917, there is a massive anti-Black race riot in East St. Louis. It's uncertain the full scale of the event, but according to the EGI, the Equal Justice Institute, who studies this sort of thing, they say that white mobs may have killed beaten about 200 African Americans to death. Some 6,000 were forced to flee East St. Louis. Millions in property damage occurred, and this was the era, it's 1917, an era of high lynching. We're 2 years away from the Red Summer of 1919, a few years away, 4 years away from the famous Tulsa race riot, in which the St. Louis was like a precursor to that. African Americans trying to figure out how to respond to this decide they're going to have a massive parade in New York City. 100,000 people will march in the parade, and they say we're going to do so silently. And so they have this massive silent parade as a type of protest in the United States for this ongoing violence and lynching. And one of the figures leading the march is holding up a sign. And the sign is this reminder to the United States, and it says basically, Crispus Attucks, the first who shed blood for independence, right? And I thought it was interesting to start there on how Crispus Attucks, a figure who himself is mired in the American Revolution, the paradox of the Declaration of Independence and the Revolution, and how he's then used as this form of activism in 1917. And this is not the first time the Crispus Attucks would be used in this type of way. In the 1850s, abolitionists and free African Americans, during the era of crisis, as slavery is much more pushed to the forefront of American politics, there will be an abolitionist artist by the name of Champney who creates this lithograph of Crispus Attucks at the Boston Massacre, but they center him right in the center, right? And they show him as the main one leading this event of the Boston Massacre being killed. And this is a way in the 1850s to bring people on board to abolitionism, to say, look, African Americans, this is what they've done for this country. Crispus Attucks is this famous figure you may not know, but he's necessary. So let's go back then to the Revolutionary era and talk about who Crispus Attucks is. Crispus Attucks, we don't know too much about him, other than he appears to have been a fugitive slave, perhaps of African and Native American descent. At the time when he makes his way to freedom, he may have also been a sailor. He ends up in Boston, in the port city of Boston. This is the Revolutionary era. This is before the era of This is the colonial era. There is no free North at this time. Slavery exists everywhere there are colonies in the United States. And so addicts can't run to a free state. He can simply find himself in Boston harbors and try to pass himself off as a free person because there are free blacks who work there. And he becomes working there, likely had been a sailor before, so now he works on the docks and what have you. We don't know what ends up creating this fateful event in March of 1770 with Crispus Attucks. There had been confrontations before with British soldiers and people working on the docks, whoever they were, over job competition. At the time, you were a soldier, you didn't just soldier, you needed extra work, and so some British soldiers were taking jobs. But there was also all, of course, this revolutionary rhetoric in the air. Whatever the cause, we know what happens on March 5th, 1770. Crispus Attucks and several other confront a British garrison who fire on them. 4 people are killed, many other are wounded. Paul Revere and others will go on to make the famous lithograph of this event, and they will call it the Boston Massacre, right? And it becomes the key piece of patriot propaganda for the American Revolution. Crispus Attucks himself, though he's certainly mentioned in the newspapers at the time. They talk about he's paraded, his body is paraded along with the others, paraded through the streets. He becomes kind of lost in a lot of American history. The people who do manage to keep him in their thoughts are African Americans. Free African Americans from the time of Crispus Attucks' death memorialize him continuously. They name schools after him. They name societies and institutions after him, literary societies. In the 1850s, they will even name a militia after him because there are African Americans who are creating these type of black armed militias during the 1850s to fight against fugitive slave catchers, but also, as one historian says, perhaps to rehearse for the coming Civil War, which, though many people don't think it's going to happen, they believe something like this is on the horizon, right? So Crispus Attucks is this figure that free African Americans keep alive, and they continue to keep him alive, naming schools after him and everything else, even down to the point of using him in this 1917 march, as I spoke about, right? They keep this memory of Crispus Attucks alive and what he means. What's interesting about Attucks is that we don't know why he did what he did that day. We're uncertain about the story. The reason we know a lot about him, in fact, is because John Adams is defending the British soldiers, because John Adams is concerned that the various different riots and outbursts will make the more conservative and elite figures who they want to join the revolution. It'll shy them away from it. And so when he is defending the British soldier, John Adams kind of singles out Crispus Attucks. And he says, of course the British had to shoot. This guy looks scary. And he talks about his physical strength and how he looked. And he plays on racial sentiments at the time. And he makes Crispus Attucks this central figure, right? In fact, he basically says that the people who attacked the British soldiers were Crispus Attucks and a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes, mulattoes, Irish teagues, and outlandish jacktards, right? Trying to paint them as this bottom rung of society who have engaged in all this. So we don't know why Crispus Attucks does what he did. Regardless, he becomes this central figure, this martyr for the revolution, right? Where African Americans will often cite him as the first. Long before the first shots fired in Concord, they will say, no, it is Crispus Attucks. They have an alternative history. It is Crispus Attucks who becomes the first martyr for the American cause, right? And I think Crispus Attucks really symbolizes, I guess, the heart of this thing, what historians have called the American paradox. The fact that the United States in the Declaration of Independence basically speaks of ideas of liberty, of freedom, the self-evident truth of the equality of mankind, but also as a nation where, something at least, I think it's up to 3/4 of those signing the Declaration of Independence will at some point in their lives own slaves, from George Washington to Benjamin Franklin, right? All are slave owners at some point in their lives. And this paradox sits there. It's what Abraham Lincoln would later talk about, right? Part of this American original sin that basically has laid at the root of American liberty and freedom, this dichotomy of slavery. And it literally is embodied in Crispus Attucks. Here is Crispus Attucks, a fugitive slave, a man who himself is not free. And yet, whatever the reasons for his actions, he will become part of the key propaganda arm of the Sons of Liberty to bring other people to the cause of freedom, right, for the United States and the cause of the Declaration. So I'm just talking a bit about this paradox, because this paradox was understood at the time. Those patriots who were thinking about freedom and liberty they were well aware that slavery created a bit of a paradox. Sometimes it was abstract because the patriots called themselves slaves often. They said, we will not be slaves to the British. We will not be treated like slaves, right? And, you know, some of them were saying it abstractly. Some of them said it quite literally. George Washington says, we should not be ruled over by the British with the same arbitrary way in which we rule over our Negroes, right? And so there are some people who are using it abstract, and it might be cognitive dissonance, and there are some people who understand very directly what they mean by this idea of freedom and liberty and the paradox. And the British certainly try to highlight this, right? There's a long-running battle between Benjamin Franklin and British writers who are basically saying, you guys keep talking about freedom, but you have a bunch of slaves, right? And they go back and forth, and one of them says famously, how is it we hear the greatest yelps of freedom from the drivers of Negroes, right? In their attacks on the patriots. And so this issue is constantly within the rhetoric of the revolution, and the British fling it at them, and there are patriots themselves who have to wrestle with this contradiction. And who is listening to all of this, of course? Enslaved people, right? In Charleston, Virginia, the Sons of Liberty go out to protest the Stamp Act, and they go into the streets, and they march liberty, freedom, you know, we will not be oppressed. A few months later, who follows them in a similar march? The slaves of Charleston. They walk into the streets and say, yeah, we like that idea of liberty and freedom. We will also not be oppressed. Unlike with the Sons of Liberty, the local militia is immediately called out to put those slaves back in their cabin, right? The contradiction and the paradox is there. Slavery for some, freedom for some, freedom not for others, right? But that contradiction is there. This revolution is also an ideological revolution. We will see this from African Americans such as Phyllis Wheatley, the enslaved African American poet named after the very slave ship she arrives on, the Phyllis. Definitely. And so Phyllis Wheatley herself speaks about the revolution, speaks about patriotism. And when she's, you know, people inquire, like, how is it you, an enslaved person, are concerned with these high ideals of liberty and freedom? And she basically says that in her poems, you know, I'm not going to quote the poem, most of you may know it, she basically like, you're asking where my idea of freedom comes from. She says enslaved people understand freedom better than anyone else. We didn't need Enlightenment ideals. We didn't need Thomas Paine writing a pamphlet. We understand it intrinsically, right? And she writes about this in her poetry and talks about the revolution belonging to enslaved people as well. And basically, while she cheers on the revolution, she also challenges them. So does Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes is a free African American born in West Hartford, so right here at home. Lemuel Haynes at the time is also caught up in the revolutionary rhetoric. He will go off to become a militiaman and fight for the Patriot forces in Vermont. But around the time after he hears of the Declaration, he writes his own book called Liberty Further Extended. And in there, much of it is a religious treaty, but he basically also pulls directly from the Declaration of Independence. He pulls from the preamble, he talks about liberty and freedom, and he basically says that this liberty is not done, right? What about slavery? What about the issue of inequality? When is that going to be addressed, right? And so here we have people adopting the Declaration and the ideals of freedom for themselves, and at the same time critiquing it in their own way. Enslaved people also use the Declaration to write their own petitions. Here in Fairfield, it happens all throughout the colonies, but here in Fairfield County, for instance, enslaved people write a document, and they basically petition the local colonial government. And they say, look, if you guys are saying that we are all created equal, they use the Declaration again, they use the words of the Declaration, and they pen this treatise, and they basically say, if you're saying all of this, then how is it you hold us in slavery, right? How is it you condone slavery? And so this document actually reaches the local Connecticut government, and they mostly reject it. Some are thrown out or rejected, but they keep coming. Enslaved people keep using the rhetoric of the revolution to argue that the revolution is undone, right? That the ideas of the Declaration are great, but they are unfinished and they are unrealized. As I said, Lemuel Haynes is one of those who will fight himself for the Patriots, even though he has this criticism of the Declaration of Independence. He finds enough within it, this important document and ideas of freedom, to join up. Altogether, some 5,000 African Americans, free and enslaved, will serve along the Patriot forces. There will be some 80 plus African Americans who will fight at Bunker Hill and elsewhere throughout the war. Some of these people are enslaved and they run off to join the Patriot Army. Some are manumitted by their owners for the purpose of joining the Patriot cause. It turns out that, let's say you were really into the Patriot cause, but you're kind of allergic to bullets and cannons. You could make a contract with an enslaved person that you would manumit them if they would go off and fight for the Patriots, right? And so there were some enslaved people who made this deal, risking life, right, to go off to fight for the Patriot cause and freedom in order to gain their freedom. And there were also a good number of free African Americans like Lemuel Haynes. They had a lot of reasons for doing so, right? Some people did so because enslaved people, certainly they thought they could gain freedom. For free people like African Americans like Lemuel Haynes, they also wanted to see the end of slavery, but also they hoped in this new nation they could have equality, right? And so they go off and they believe in these ideals. Or if you're at Bunker Hill, your own farms and homes are being attacked, so you're going to fight, right? And so some 5,000 will fight, especially in the fledgling Patriot Navy, which really needs people. One person, however, who is not on board with this early on is George Washington. George Washington sees black men mustered among his troops, and he himself is a Virginia planter and a slave owner, and he thinks this is no good. This could give ideas to enslaved people and others, and he basically creates a military order that bars all black people, free or enslaved, from the Patriot Army, right? But he will make a reversal within about a month. So why does he make this reversal? Well, it turns out that while Washington is reluctant for the use of black people in the Patriot Army, there are others who are also making a play for black people in the United States, and that is the British, right? In Virginia, for example, enslaved people are watching and listening to all of this fervor between the British and the Americans, and they're wondering, what are they going to do? Lord Dunmore, the British governor of Virginia, decides that he has had enough of this patriot nonsense. These guys in Virginia are starting to sound like those upstarts in Massachusetts. He is going to basically start a rumor that if they continue this, he will arm their slaves and turn their slaves against them, right? To put down any more talk of rebellion. Two things happen here. Enslaved people see this as, well, this is our chance. They show up at Dunmore's mansion and they say, hey, when you're ready, we're ready. Dunmore is actually surprised at this. It doesn't seem that he intended, he wanted a bluff. He tells them to go home, and so they wait at home. The other unexpected consequence is that the many whites and colonists in Virginia are incensed. Colonists in Virginia who may not have thought of joining the rebellion before now want to join the rebellion, because how dare Dunmore basically threaten to have their slaves murder them in their beds. Before he knows it, a large number of patriots are marching on Dunmore's mansion. He has to flee. When he flees, he has to now call upon those slaves and make good on his call. They will show up and help ferry him to a boat. He will now name these black soldiers who fight for the British, the Ethiopian Regiment. And after one of them manages to capture their own slave owner, who's a patriot leader, he actually issues his famous proclamation, basically giving freedom to any enslaved people who will join the British cause to put down the rebellion. So his threat is now made realized. And how many show up? Thousands. Thousands of enslaved people will flock to the British. We don't know how many altogether, but the numbers range from 20 to 80 to 100,000 will flee, heading to the British. Some of George Washington's slaves slip away and head off to the British. Right? The British are offering freedom, and they go there in large numbers. It's even thought, though it's not confirmed, that some of these Ethiopian regiments, some claim that they may have even put the words "liberty to slaves" on their jackets, right? And so in a sort of a way telling you this is the freedom that we are fighting for, even if we're fighting for the British. Now, of course, this is a strategic alliance. The British are the greatest slave traders on earth at this time. Enslaved people realize this, the British realize this. This is a strategic alliance that they make. But the British may want able-bodied men to fight, but who runs? Everyone. Old, elderly people run, women run in droves, families run, everyone runs to the British lines, so much that they overwhelm the British lines, right? But this also has an effect. It plays its own role among the Patriot forces. George Washington, watching all of this that December, writes his fellow Virginian planter, Richard Henry Lee, and says, this is madness, right? He says, if this man Dunmore is not crushed by the spring, he said he will become the greatest arch enemy in America, right? And he writes these series of letters to Richard Henry Lee saying, like, this can't continue. If this happens, then we will also have to arm Negroes, as he says, quote unquote, and this will become a game of who can arm the Negroes faster, right? And so it's not surprising that it's not the only reason, but certainly one of the key reasons that about a month later, Washington reverses his call. He doesn't allow enslaved people to join, but he does now say free African Americans can join the United States, well, this time the Patriot cause, right, in order to fight. And so we see here how slavery, the rhetoric, the actual instance of slavery begins to impact the revolution itself. And if people remember, does everybody know who Richard Henry Lee is? Anybody know that name that he's writing? So Richard Henry Lee, the Virginia government during this time, the Patriot government that forms, writes its own resolution, and Virginia and Massachusetts are the two states pushing for independence. The mid-Atlantic states, they're not certain. New York, Pennsylvania is really like, I don't know. I'm all for dumping some tea and things, but independence, that's kind of out there. But everybody knows the folks in Massachusetts are absolutely independence crazy. Virginia is also strong, really strong, but people see them as at least a little bit more moderate. And so it's up to Richard Henry Lee, often in the Continental Congress, to basically push the other states towards independence. His own Virginia had created their own, one of the first to create an independence decree, basically telling their delegates, when you get there, push for independence. And in their own push for independence, they cite all of the other things, such as the Stamp Act and all of the various grievances. But the one grievance they also talk about is the fact that Lord Dunmore, this evil governor, dares arm their slaves against them, right? Richard Henry Lee, this person that George Washington is writing, and they're going back and forth about this issue of enslaved people being armed against them, will be the person on June 2nd who will stand up at the Continental Congress and put forth the motion for writing and drafting a Declaration of Independence, right? This is Richard Henry Lee. And the person who will end up writing it, become the main drafter, it's many people who write it, but the main drafter will be their fellow Virginia planter, Thomas Jefferson. When Thomas Jefferson is drafting the Declaration, people are familiar with the Declaration. Starts off with the preamble with all the high ideals. Remember what's next? All the grievances. Right? What has King George done? He's done this, he's done that, he's done all these things. There are 27 of them, but there's a 28th. The 28th grievance that Thomas Jefferson writes is the longest, and it is a grievance against King George for the transatlantic slave trade. Now, before you think, oh, Jefferson, lofty person, Jefferson is a massive slave owner. His largest grief with the King George and the transatlantic slave trade is part of this longer battle that Benjamin Franklin and others have been having, and you're to blame for the slave trade. No, you are. No, you are. No, you are. He puts this in here. He charges King George with this, and he also says, and now that you've bought all these slaves here, you want to arm them and turn them against us, right? This is the longest grievance. These Virginians, again, Washington, Lee, Thomas, put this into the document. When it goes to the final committee, they look at this and they say, okay, one, South Carolina and the other Southern colonies do not want that in there at all. Most of the others don't want it in there at all either, because they said it sounds weird. I don't know how to explain the slavery thing. We know it sounds weird. And so it is the one grievance that is excised from the Declaration of Independence. But this is where I'm going to end, to just point out how this paradox that we talk about with the Declaration, these ideas that we're still dealing with, how to deal with ideas of liberty and a nation that is constantly trying to perfect itself towards freedom and make steps forward, make steps back. This was something that the Patriots themselves were dealing with. This was something that free and enslaved people at the time, whether they were black, white, or what have you, Native Americans, others were dealing with. And we see how this issue that has been perplexing the United States since its founding remains with us today. And that's where I'm going to end, because I'm hot. I really am hot.
And those ribs is waiting for you.
I'm really hot. Good. It's exactly. I'm at 2:01. I'm like 1 minute over, and I started late. That's great. Oh, they don't have to request a Q&A, do you?
If anybody has any questions, now is the time to ask. For the ribs, continue to call.
Yes, I have ribs on the grill. Go ahead. Sure. Of course, there's the great article. There's a great Benjamin Quarles, this African-American writer, who's one of the first to really put this forth in the 1950s. He writes this book. He actually writes it, I want to say, like in 1976. I think he writes it for the at the bicentennial. He talks about Negroes in the American Revolution. That's an older book, but there have been a lot of more recent books. One, I'm blanking on the author right now, but there's one basically called Black Patriots and Loyalists, and it looks at both who have written, but many people have written on it, and so yeah, you can go to the Smithsonian African American Museum site. They talk about it, but certainly I would recommend Benjamin Carl's as one of the first, and then a more modern book. I can't remember the name, but Black Patriots and Loyalists. Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you guys. I'm off.